Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to Beyond Curious and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way YouTube keeps showing you stories just like this one. Now let's begin. My name's Marisol Vega. I'm 28, and for about 3 years I've worked as a lay assistant to a priest named Father Callum Doyle at a parish in a mid-sized city I'd rather keep unnamed. I mostly handle scheduling, paperwork, and the kind of administrative work that keeps a rectory running day to day. Father Doyle is in his 50s, careful and a little dry-humoured, not the type you'd picture running toward anything dramatic, which is part of why it surprised me last winter when the diocese asked him to take on additional training in what they call, formally, exorcism ministry. I want to be upfront that this isn't some rare, secretive thing. There's been a real documented rise in request for this kind of prayer ministry over the last couple of years, enough that the wider church has been actively training more priests to handle the volume. Father Doyle told me himself that the overwhelming majority of people who reach out are dealing with something the church takes seriously in a completely different way. Grief, untreated mental illness, addiction. He said the formal rite gets used only after a long, careful screening process rules almost everything else out first. That screening process is where I came in. Part of my job became fielding the initial calls, taking down names and passing along enough detail that Father Doyle could decide who needed a referral to a counsellor and who needed a longer conversation with him directly. I did that for months without anything happening that felt like more than paperwork. Most calls were sad in an ordinary way. A grieving widow who kept smelling her husband's cologne in an empty house. A college student convinced her dorm room was cursed after a bad breakup. I logged them, passed them along, and moved on with my day. The call that changed, that came in early spring, from a woman named Diane Ashworth about her 16-year-old son, Caleb. She was careful and specific on the phone in a way some of the other callers hadn't been. No wild claims about spinning heads or thrown furniture. Just a mother describing behaviour in her son that had started small and gotten worse over about 6 weeks. Caleb had started speaking in a voice that wasn't his own late at night, always around the same time, and Diane said he had no memory of it afterward. I took the details down the way I'd been trained to, told her Father Doyle would be in touch, and told myself, the way you do, that this was probably one more case that would resolve into something explainable once the doctor got involved. Father Doyle met with Diane and Caleb 3 times before he told me anything more than the bare minimum. On the 4th visit, he asked me to come along and take notes, which he'd never asked before. I said yes mostly out of curiosity, and a little bit of professional obligation. Not because I thought I was about to see anything I couldn't explain away by the end of the drive home. Caleb was quiet and polite when we arrived, a little pale. The kind of tired that comes from genuinely not sleeping. Diane offered us coffee with hands that shook slightly on the tray. Nothing about the first 20 minutes felt like anything beyond a stressed, exhausted family. Father Doyle asked his usual careful questions. Medical history, sleep patterns, any recent trauma, any drug use Caleb might not want to admit to his mother directly. Caleb answered everything in a flat, tired voice that read, to me, like ordinary teenage depression more than anything else. Then, a little after 9 that evening, without any obvious trigger I could see, Caleb's voice changed. Not dramatically. That's what unsettled me more than if it had been theatrical. It dropped into a lower register, flatter and slower, and he said something to Father Doyle in a language none of us in that room spoke. Diane later confirmed Caleb had never studied it. Father Doyle didn't flinch outwardly, but I noticed his pen stopped moving on the notepad in front of him. He asked Caleb a question in response, calm and even. Caleb answered again in that same unfamiliar cadence, eyes half open, staring somewhere past all of us. I told myself, sitting there with my own pen frozen over my notepad, that there had to be an explanation. A language Caleb had picked up somewhere and forgotten he knew. A rehearsed performance for his mother's benefit. Anything that kept this inside a shape, I understood. That explanation held up for maybe another minute, right up until Caleb's mother started quietly crying in a way that told me this wasn't the first time she'd watched this happen, and that she was no closer to an explanation than I was. Father Doyle didn't perform anything close to what people picture when they hear the word exorcism that night. He prayed quietly, in English, close and direct, watching Caleb's face the entire time. After a few minutes, Caleb's voice returned to normal, and he blinked at all of us like he'd just woken up from a nap he hadn't meant to take. No memory, by his own account, of the last 20 minutes. Diane didn't seem surprised by that either. Father Doyle told me afterward, in the car, that this was as far as the process ever went on a first extended visit, and that the vast majority of cases like this resolved through exactly this kind of careful, repeated pastoral attention combined with real medical treatment running alongside it. No formal rite required. I asked him, because I genuinely wanted to know, whether he thought what we'd just seen was something the medical explanations covered. He was quiet for a long moment before he told me he honestly didn't know yet. He said the screening process exists precisely because you can't tell from one visit, and that his job wasn't to decide what it was, only to keep showing up carefully and see what the pattern told him over time. Father Doyle started recording the audio of each visit not long after that, with Diane's full consent, mostly to have an accurate record for the dioceses review file rather than out of any particular suspicion. He played one of those recordings a few weeks later for a friend of his from graduate school, a linguistics professor named Wendell Ostrowski, who has a habit of tapping his pen against his front teeth whenever he's working through a problem that isn't yielding easy answers. Father Doyle told me Ostrowski listened to the recording 3 separate times, tapping that pen the whole while, before admitting he couldn't identify the language. He couldn't even confidently place it within a known language family. Then he asked, half joking and half not, whether Father Doyle was certain the recording hadn't been altered somehow. Father Doyle assured him it hadn't. Ostrowski asked to keep a copy for his own research. As far as I know, he still hasn't come back with an answer. I'll admit I did some of my own digging after that. Mostly late at night, mostly against my better judgment. I ran a short clip of the recording, the part Father Doyle had cleared me to hear, through a couple of language identification tools online, the kind built for travellers trying to figure out what sign they're looking at. Every one of them came back with a different guess, and none of the guesses agreed with each other closely enough to mean anything. I posted a few seconds of it, stripped of any identifying detail, to a linguistics forum under a throwaway account, and got back a handful of confident-sounding replies that each named a different, obscure regional dialect. None of them held up when I checked the actual vocabulary against what I had heard in that hallway. I stopped posting after that. It felt suddenly like the kind of question I didn't actually want a stranger on the internet to answer correctly. That pattern kept unfolding over the following 2 months. Father Doyle visited the Ashworth family 6 more times that I know of, 3 of which I sat in on. The voice returned on 4 of those 6 visits, always a little after 9, always in that same unfamiliar language Caleb had never studied. Caleb, in his lucid hours, told his mother he'd started feeling something he described only as being watched from just behind his own eyes, which is about as much as he was ever able to put into words. Diane brought Caleb to 2 different doctors during this stretch. Both of them ran a full battery of tests and found nothing conclusive. No seizure activity, no clear psychiatric diagnosis that fully accounted for the specific pattern of the episodes. One of them told her carefully that this kind of case sometimes simply doesn't resolve into a clean answer either direction, medical or otherwise, and that the most responsible thing she could do was keep both doors open rather than commit fully to one explanation. The second doctor, according to Diane, asked to sit in on one of Father Doyle's visits herself, purely out of professional curiosity. She left after about 20 minutes without saying much of anything, though Diane told me she'd seen the woman's hands shaking slightly as she packed up her bag, in a way they hadn't been shaking when she arrived. I asked Father Doyle, toward the end of that stretch, whether the diocese would eventually approve moving forward with the formal rite if things didn't improve. He told me the decision sits well above his own authority, that it requires sign-off from a bishop after an extensive documented case file, and that Caleb's case, as unsettling as it had been to witness firsthand, still hadn't cleared every box that process requires. He said honestly, more often than not, this is where cases like this sit for a long time, not cleared for the formal rite, not explained by medicine either, just carefully, patiently monitored. I still handle the intake calls. I've learned not to assume, the way I used to, that a careful, specific caller means a case that will resolve into something explainable by the end of the month. Diane still calls the rectory every couple of weeks with an update. Caleb's episodes have slowed to roughly once a month instead of several times a week, which everyone involved is calling progress, though nobody's told me, in so many words, what they think actually caused the slowdown. Father Doyle still visits when they ask him to. Professor Ostrowski still has his copy of that recording. I still don't know what language that was, and neither, as far as I can tell, does anyone else who's tried to find out. A few weeks ago, closing up the rectory office late on a Thursday, I found myself standing in the doorway of the small side room where we keep the old case files, listening to nothing in particular, the way you do when a building settles around you at the end of a long day. I told myself that's all it was. I locked the door behind me the way I always do, and I didn't look back at that room again before I left. My name's Aaron Holloway. I'm 32, and last October my partner, Nate Kowalski, and I closed on our first house together. It was a 100-year-old colonial in a small town about 40 minutes outside Boston that we'd been saving for since before we were even engaged. I want to start there because I think it matters how much that house meant to us going in. We weren't naive, we got the inspection, we got the disclosures, we did everything a careful buyer is supposed to do. Nothing on paper gave us any reason to think twice. The realtor who sold it to us, a friendly, fast-talking man named Doug Feeney, who has a habit of clicking his pen open and shut whenever he's waiting on you to make a decision, told us the house had been owned by the same family for almost 40 years before an estate sale brought it to market. He mentioned, in passing, that the previous owner had passed away in the home, which didn't strike either of us as unusual for a house that old. We didn't ask any follow-up questions about it. I want to be honest that it genuinely didn't occur to us there was a follow-up question worth asking. The first few months were exactly what you'd hope for. We painted. We argued cheerfully over paint colours. We hosted Nate's family for Thanksgiving in a dining room that still smelled faintly of fresh paint. If you'd asked me in November whether anything about that house felt wrong, I would have laughed at you. That started to change in December. In small ways, I mostly explained away without much thought. A door at the top of the stairs that we always left open would occasionally be shut in the morning, which we chalked up to old houses settling unevenly. A cold patch of air in the upstairs hallway that never quite matched the rest of the house's temperature, which we blamed on bad insulation and added to a growing list of small renovation projects. Nate mentioned, almost as a joke, that he sometimes felt like someone was standing just behind him when he worked late in his upstairs office. I told him he was tired. He agreed with me easily enough that I didn't think much more about it. The first thing that actually rattled me happened in January, close to midnight, when I woke up to the bedroom door slowly swinging open on its own. No draft, no obvious cause. The hallway beyond it completely dark and completely still. I lay there for a long minute, telling myself it was the house settling the way old houses do, the same explanation I'd been leaning on for 2 months by then. That explanation held up right up until it happened again 3 nights later, at almost exactly the same time. I mentioned it to a neighbour a few weeks after that, an older woman named Sylvia Pruitt who lives 2 houses down and has a habit of twisting her wedding ring around her finger when she's deciding how much to say. I brought it up casually, expecting her to laugh it off the way I wanted to laugh it off myself. She didn't laugh. She went quiet, twisted that ring a few times, and finally told me the previous owner, a woman named Helen, hadn't just passed away in the house peacefully the way Doug Feeney's phrasing had implied. Sylvia said Helen had lived alone in that house for the last several years of her life, increasingly convinced her late husband was still present in the home with her, talking to an empty upstairs hallway most nights before her family finally found her. I asked Sylvia carefully why none of that had come up during the sale. She told me a little uncomfortably that everyone on the street had known Helen's history, and that nobody had felt it was really their place to say anything to strangers moving in, especially once the estate sale was already underway. She said it kindly, but it stuck with me for days afterward that a whole street's worth of people had quietly known something about our house that we hadn't, and had decided, collectively, and without ever discussing it, that it wasn't information we needed. I called Doug Feeney directly after that conversation, more rattled than I meant to sound on the phone. He was careful with his words in a way that told me he'd had this exact conversation before with someone else. He told me that in our state, sellers and their agents aren't required to disclose anything about a property's history like that unless a buyer asks about it directly, and that as long as nobody lied to us when we didn't ask, nothing about the sale had actually broken any rule. I asked him if he'd known about Helen's history going in. He was quiet for a second too long before he told me he'd heard some things from the estate's lawyer, but that legally, it simply hadn't been his obligation to bring it up unprompted. I hung up angrier than I'd been in a long time. I'm not entirely sure who I was actually angry at. Nate and I talked about what to do for most of a week. Selling immediately felt drastic, and the market that winter wasn't kind to sellers. We decided instead to just watch closely for a while. Keep a log of anything unusual, the way you'd track any other maintenance issue in an old house. That log filled up faster than either of us expected. The door at the top of the stairs kept closing itself, always overnight. Never once while either of us was awake to see it happen. The cold patch in the hallway spread slowly until it reached the doorway of what used to be, according to Sylvia, Helen's late husband's old study. Nate started sleeping with a light on in that hallway, which he'd never done in his life before that winter. He also started rubbing at the back of his neck without noticing he was doing it every time he had to walk past that door alone. We hired a contractor that same month to look at the insulation around the cold patch. A practical, no-nonsense man named Ray Delacroix, who has a habit of whistling low through his teeth whenever he's sizing up a job he doesn't love the look of. He spent about 20 minutes up there with a thermal camera before coming back down, looking less certain than he had going up. He told us the readings didn't make sense, that the wall itself tested normal, but the air just inside that section of hallway ran nearly 10 degrees colder than everywhere else on the same floor, with no draft source he could find to explain it. He gave us a quote for insulation work anyway. Then, almost as an afterthought while packing up his tools, he mentioned that he generally preferred not to schedule jobs in that particular house for late afternoon, if it was all the same to us, on account of losing the light early back there. We didn't ask him what he meant. I think some part of both of us already suspected the answer. I went looking for Helen's history on my own after that, mostly through old local newspaper archives and a few public record searches on a weekend Nate was travelling for work. I found her obituary easily enough, warm and ordinary, survived by 2 adult children, active for decades in a local garden club. I found almost nothing about her husband beyond a much older obituary from nearly 15 years earlier, and one short item in the town's community paper from around that same time, thanking neighbours for their support during what it called a difficult period for the Halstead family, without ever specifying what that period had actually involved. I sat with that phrase for a long time. Difficult period, turning it over the way you turn over a word that's trying very hard not to tell you anything. The worst night came in February, close to 1 a.m, when we both woke to the sound of a man's voice, low and indistinct, coming from that same upstairs hallway. Neither of us could make out actual words. Both of us heard it clearly enough to know it wasn't the house settling, and both of us lay frozen in bed for what felt like a very long time before either of us said anything out loud. Nate finally asked me if I'd heard it too. I told him I had. Neither of us got back to sleep that night. We put the house back on the market that spring, at a loss, after barely 6 months of ownership. We told our own realtor, a different one this time, everything Sylvia had told us, and made a point of disclosing Helen's full history to every single potential buyer who walked through, whether they asked or not. Most of them didn't ask a single follow-up question. One family, a young couple who reminded me uncomfortably of Nate and me 8 months earlier, bought the house anyway, thanked us for being upfront, and told us they didn't put much stock in that kind of thing. I think about that couple sometimes. I hope the door stays open for them. I hope Nate and I were just 2 anxious first-time buyers who talked ourselves into something that wasn't really there. But I still can't walk past an old colonial house with an upstairs hallway without my chest tightening a little. And I know now, in a way I didn't before, that a street full of people can know something true about the place you live and simply decide, quietly, that it isn't theirs to tell you. Ray Delacroix, the contractor, sent us a card a few months after we'd moved. A short, kind note wishing us well in the new place, and one line at the very bottom that I have read more times than I probably should have. He said he was glad we'd gotten out when we did, and that some houses, in his experience, just take a little longer than others to let a family go. He didn't explain what he meant by that either. By then, I had stopped expecting anyone connected to that house to explain themselves fully, and started simply listening for what they left out instead. My name's Jordan Castellano. I'm 27, and until last spring, Most of what I knew about my younger sister Bree's life for almost a year came through short, cheerful texts. They always seemed to arrive a little too on schedule, always upbeat, always light on actual detail. Bree's 24, and after a bad breakup and losing her job in the same 6-week stretch 2 years ago, she found what she described to our parents as a healing community out in the Cascade foothills called Amaranth Hearth. It focused on communal living, simple work, and what their materials called intentional presence. I want to be honest that none of us thought much of it at first. Bree's always been the sibling who throws herself completely into things. Yoga teacher training 1 year, a strict elimination diet the next. This looked from the outside like one more version of that same pattern. The text started changing sometime around the 6-month mark, though it took me longer than it should have to notice the pattern instead of just the individual messages. They got shorter. They started arriving at almost the exact same time each week, Sunday evenings, like a scheduled check-in rather than a sister texting whenever she felt like it. She stopped mentioning specific people by name, referring instead to the community or the family in a way that started to grate on me without my fully understanding why. When I asked to visit, she put me off twice, both times citing a busy season at the property, before finally agreeing to a single afternoon visit in early spring. I drove up expecting, honestly, a slightly awkward but ultimately reassuring visit. What I found instead was a property tucked well back from the nearest paved road, a cluster of cabins and a larger central lodge, a communal garden, and a small group of residents who greeted me with a warmth that felt, even then, slightly rehearsed. Bree looked thinner than I remembered and talked with a kind of careful, measured calm that wasn't like her at all. I told myself she'd probably just picked up some of the vocabulary and cadence of the place, the way you do when you spend enough time somewhere new. That explanation held up for most of the visit. An older man named Silas Vance, who the residents referred to simply as an elder, joined us for part of the afternoon. He had a habit I noticed almost immediately of pausing to align a set of wooden beads on his wrist before he answered any question with more than a few words, like he was giving himself a beat to choose his phrasing carefully. He spoke in warm, unhurried sentences about intentional community and healing from what he called the noise of the outside world. He answered my more pointed questions about phones, money, and how residents could leave if they wanted to, with a calm that somehow made me feel rude for having asked in the first place, rather than actually answering the question. I left that afternoon telling myself it had been a slightly strange but essentially harmless visit. That held up for about another month, until Bree stopped answering my texts entirely. Instead, occasional messages arrived from a shared community phone rather than her own, written in a slightly different tone than the ones before, reassuring me she was fine, busy, at peace, in a way that started to feel less like Bree's voice and more like a summary of it. I called our parents, and we agreed I'd try a second visit, this time unannounced. I almost talked myself out of going, mostly out of embarrassment at how dramatic showing up unannounced at your sister's wellness retreat sounds said out loud to another adult. I went anyway. The second visit was different from the first in ways that were hard to name specifically but impossible to ignore. Bree was pulled away from our conversation twice by other residents for reasons that were never quite explained, always with the same gentle, immovable insistence. Silas Vance appeared again partway through, aligning those same wooden beads before he told me, still warmly, that unannounced visits weren't really in keeping with the community's rhythms, and that future visits would need to be scheduled well in advance, through him personally. I asked Bree, alone for about 90 seconds while Silas spoke with another resident nearby, whether she actually wanted to stay. She told me she was happy, in that same measured, careful voice, but her eyes did something I'd known since we were kids, a specific way she looks anywhere but directly at you when she's not telling the whole truth. I didn't get another chance to ask before Silas rejoined us. I drove home that night and called the county sheriff's non-emergency line. I laid out everything I'd seen as calmly as I could manage. The deputy who took the call was polite and clearly used to fielding calls like mine. He told me the property had no record of any actual criminal complaint, that residents were adults free to associate however they chose, and that without a specific report of abuse or a clear crime, there wasn't much his department could actively investigate. He said it kindly, almost apologetically. I hung up with the distinct sinking feeling that I was on my own with this. I reached out, over the following weeks, to a woman I found through an online forum for families of people involved with communities like Amaranth Hearth. She told me carefully that she'd heard second-hand accounts, never anything she could point to directly. Residents who tried to leave were gently but persistently talked out of it by a rotating team of 2 or 3 residents assigned specifically to that job. She said the community had never, as far as she knew, physically restrained anyone. She said the pressure worked so well they'd never needed to. She also mentioned, almost as an aside, that a similar property 2 states over had been raided earlier that year after allegations involving forced marriage and financial control surfaced publicly. Though she was careful to say she had no evidence tying the 2 communities together beyond a similar structure and similar language in their recruitment materials. I spent a long weekend after that call reading everything public I could find about the property 2 states over. A place called Cedar Hollow Fellowship that had been raided that spring after allegations of forced marriage and financial control among its members came to light. The reporting was careful and limited. Mostly court filings and a handful of statements from former residents who'd agreed to speak only anonymously. But the language in Cedar Hollow's old recruitment materials, still cached online from before the group scrubbed its website, used almost the exact same phrases Amaranth Hearth's own materials did. Intentional presence, healing from the noise of the outside world, a family you choose instead of the one that failed you. I sat with my laptop open until nearly 3 in the morning that night, reading the same paragraphs over and over, trying to decide whether I was seeing a real pattern or just finding one, because I badly wanted an explanation for what was happening to my sister. I made a 3rd visit in early June, this time with a plan instead of just a hope. I had arranged through a single brief phone call Bree had managed to make from a gas station during a supply run to meet her at the edge of the property's tree line at 11 that night, away from the lodge and the cabins, where a service road eventually connected back to the paved county road about a mile out. I parked well before the property's entrance and walked the last stretch on foot in the dark, more frightened than I let myself admit at the time. Bree was waiting at the tree line exactly where she'd said, a small bag over one shoulder, glancing back toward the lodge every few seconds. We didn't talk, we just started walking, fast, toward where I'd left the car. We were maybe halfway back when a flashlight beam swept across the trees behind us, followed by a second one, and a voice, not loud, but carrying clearly in the still night air, calling Bree's name in a tone that was trying very hard to still sound gentle. Bree grabbed my arm and picked up her pace without saying anything. I didn't ask questions either. We reached the car with the flashlight beam still visible. Closer now, moving steadily along the tree line behind us. I had the engine running before Bree's door was fully shut. Nobody followed us onto the paved road, at least not that I could see in the mirrors the whole drive back. Bree didn't say much until we were almost 40 minutes away, at which point she started crying in a way I hadn't seen from her since we were teenagers. She told me, in pieces, some of what those 2 visits and a year of careful phone check-ins had never let her say out loud. How the money she'd arrived with had gradually become the community's money. How leaving had always technically been allowed and somehow never actually simple. How the 2 residents who'd once tried to leave before her had both come back within a week, each time described afterward by Silas and everyone else as having simply changed their minds. Bree's been out for a little over a month now. She's staying with our parents, seeing a counsellor who specialises in high control groups, slowly starting to sound like herself again in ways that still catch me off guard when they happen. The sheriff's department opened a file after I brought Bree in to give a statement, though the deputy who took it was careful to tell us that without residents willing to come forward directly, and without a specific identifiable crime committed against Bree herself, there wasn't much more they could pursue right now. Amaranth Hearth, as far as any of us can tell, is still exactly where it was, still holding whatever family gatherings it holds, Silas Vance still presumably pausing to align those same wooden beads before he answers whatever questions get asked of him these days. I think about the 2 residents who came back within a week more than I probably should. I don't know their names. I don't know if anyone's coming for them the way I came for Bree. Bree told me one more thing on that drive home that I haven't been able to put down since. She said that in her last few weeks at the property, she'd started keeping a private running list in her head of every resident she could remember arriving after her, and that the number of new arrivals over just that 1 year had been higher than she ever would have guessed from the outside. I asked her carefully if she had any sense of how many people were still up at that lodge right now. She looked out the passenger window for a long moment before she told me she honestly wasn't sure anymore, and that she wasn't sure the people up there were sure either.